Okay, welcome back everybody, and thank you for your patience. So the structure of this feedback is going to be, I'm going to initially provide the results, and then I'm going to provide a justification from team that ranked first to the team that ranked fourth. So the team that ranked first in this debate was the closing opposition, Team Sri Lanka. The team that ranked second was the opening opposition, Team IUB. Third came the closing government, Nepal, and unfortunately the opening government, Maldives, came fourth. And the rationale from me is such, and I will be followed by Adil and Asif who will give their feedbacks as well. So, Sri Lanka closing opposition won this debate because they had by far the most strategic take on what constitutes the shared global responsibility to tackle climate change, how one country's reactions are likely to engender further consequences among the rest of the global community as far as the strategy for tackling climate change is concerned. So they showed us successfully that one, adaptation measures are generally resource heavy and come from wealthy, industrialized Western, usually Western nations, which if South Asian countries that are heavily populated and heavily vulnerable but resource poor were to move to this strategy, they probably engender a lot of dependency on these countries, giving them a pretty strong bargaining position when it comes to such future talks. But more importantly, there is a shift of industrialization, so to speak, whereas the countries that are already wealthy and industrialized are moving towards less polluting lifestyles and less polluting economies, whereas countries in South Asia are becoming heavily industrialized and are becoming bigger contributors. So the impasse that this put the debate at was that we are in a scenario where certain countries have historically been the most guilty, but right now are not as guilty as some of the more developing countries. And if we were to move from mitigation and adaptation as some sort of combined mixture of responses, which is the status quo, and they were the only team to identify as such, to just adaptation, then this would leave the former polluters and the wealthy nations with a lot of power, and with the judges understood that this would probably ultimately end up hurting the South Asian nations the most because they lose their ability to demand other countries mitigate their own pollution emissions. They end up being more heavily dependent, and at the same time they also do not develop the sort of best practices necessary to prevent their own contributions to climate change, which is where one of their major arguments carried the day for them as well. The idea that if there is an Eastern industrialized boom, this will cause even further degradation of the planet to an extent the planet probably can't recover from. And these are the ideas and analysis that gave them the first spot of the debate. Now, the second spot went to opening opposition. I understand that largely many of the arguments that ultimately won closing opposition, the debate was somewhat introduced by opening opposition. I think you guys had a relatively sophisticated idea of what are the challenges that are facing climate change. The difference between you and closing opposition is that a lot of those arguments were not concluded in terms of real-world impacts, in terms of how pursuing these policies, whether they would be effective, what kind of consequences they would engender from the international community, or even how they would be pursued to their logical endpoint. So for all of these reasons, I thought that while you brought up a significantly more nuanced idea of the challenges that we face from climate change, such as the fact that there is massive amounts of corruption that we have to contend with, such as the fact that ultimately adaptation measures will not trickle down to the the have-nots of society, the poorest of the poor, or that the structural changes that you bring to society will probably not be extensive enough in order to cover all of society, whereas mitigation can probably benefit everybody because the ones who depend on nature and things that are affected by climate change are often the ones who aren't resource rich, who aren't politically influential and things like that. I thought those arguments were nice. I think the extent to which mitigation is a more inclusive solution needed to be better analyzed by you, and the extent to which mitigation is a solution which can be pursued far more independently than adaptation, such as not having to depend on external resources, not having to depend on very specialized expertise, etc. these things should have come more prominently from you. So, the third theme, closing government. I felt the reason why you fell behind opening and closing opposition is largely because you didn't give us a clear enough analysis as to the failures of mitigation and the need for an immediate switch to adaptation. So try and understand on a comparative, the opposition teams very heavily underline the flaws of the adaptation model, whereas the inevitable failure of mitigation was something that you guys had to like expound upon, especially in terms of the ways in which we are failing to mitigate sufficiently, or that given mitigation is something that's very optional for a lot of the worst pollutants. Many of the worst pollutants are probably not going to mitigate. Maybe even if you analyze something along the lines of the way that human population and therefore the demand for resources and the demand for like a lot of the lifestyle choices that end up being major pollutants, you know, like every baby born is like another 9,000 tons of carbon to the atmosphere, that sort of thing. So, you know, I think in order for you to advocate a complete switch to adaptation technologies, you'd have to show us that in the pattern of human life on the planet, mitigation ultimately will not work because the tensile strength of the environment is finite, while as the human population growth and the human demand is infinite. And I think therein lay the major flaw in your case. The fact that you are showing us some very real emergencies in the real world, and you are showing us the ways that individuals, especially the very vulnerable individuals in South Asian countries, were suffering. You were not showing us why strategically the best way to stop the suffering of